So, currency conversion and foreign exchange. Where we are at the moment is that we proposed a 2 transfer, 1 transaction model. So the idea is that there will be a transfer from the payer DFSP, from the debtor to the FXP, and another transfer, and that will be in the source currency, and another transfer from the FXP to the payee DFSP, the creditor, in the target currency. There was a question over whether there should be 2 condition fulfillment pairs, one for the FXP and one for the creditor DFSP, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. But in both cases, the quote and transfer are routed via the FXP, the foreign exchange provider, by directly addressing the first phase of the operation to it. Now, that can either be done by the payer DFSP itself, who can say effectively, I can see this needs foreign exchange, so I will send the request to the foreign exchange provider, or, which is the case in the implementation of Mawali, the switch can say, I can see this transfer requires currency conversion, so I will reroute the original request to the FXP. Another consequence of this is that the FXP is a full participant in the transfer. It's like a DFSP from the point of view of the resources it needs to support. Currency conversion is managed through an extension of the existing FSP IOP API, through a specialization of it, using the extension fields at the moment. And requests for currency conversion, which is a potential problem, are made prior to the final terms of the transfer being known. That is, on the post-quotes request. Now, as you Mojaloop heads will already know, the final terms of the transfer are only agreed when the put is returned by the payee DFSP. It doesn't matter in the implementations that we are thinking about at the moment, because they explicitly forbid creditor DFSPs to add fees, which is what, of course, would mean that the request for currency conversion would be for an amount which was different, or potentially different, from the amount that was actually to be converted. So that's a kind of problem. So, oops, pardon me. It kind of looks like this. So Orange Senegal, in our example, makes a request to transfer 5,000 West African francs to Rwanda, to Honorine. The switch intercepts that and says to the FXP, I need conversion for this amount. And the FXP returns a thing that says, please transfer this converted amount, i.e. 10,000 Rwandan francs, to Honorine. That goes to MTN in Rwanda, and the transfer goes through. And you can see what happens below in the ledgers, which is to say, each participant, Orange Senegal and MTN Rwanda, has ledger entries only in its home currency. That's West African francs for Orange Senegal and Rwandan francs for MTN Rwanda. The FXP has credits in the source currency and debits in the target currency. So that's the way things work at the moment. The alternative architecture that we propose is as follows. First of all, it says currency conversion is a matter between a DFSP and an FXP. The switch shouldn't be interested or concerned. The switch should record the content of that agreement, but it doesn't need to route the quote or the transfer through the FXP. And the FXP should sign the terms under which it performs the conversion so that it can confirm to other participants that it has assented to its part in the transfer and has cleared the funds. And finally, we wanted to be able to say currency conversion can be performed either by the debtor or by the creditor DFSP. We also, I should add, wanted to say this should support what I will call wholesale currency conversions, i.e. where a participant buys an amount of a foreign currency in order to fund future transfers which it doesn't yet know about, because it can get a better rate or for other reasons. Okay, So the alternative API looks like this. You remember that I said one of the problems earlier is that we were using the existing FSP-IOP API, and we therefore had to add additional code effectively to the switch to say an FXP can use some of the endpoints in the existing API, but not all of them. So for instance, an FXP should not be able to issue the requests for directory requests, directory lookup requests, get parties, those sorts of things. In this, we have a separate set of endpoints which are purely to support currency conversion. And those are the only things that a foreign exchange provider needs to know about. So first of all, we provide a services FXP endpoint, which just returns the list of participants in that system which provide currency conversion services. There may be just one, there may be more than one, but we say it's up to the DFSP to decide which foreign exchange provider it wants to use. Now, we have two endpoints which the DFSP and the FXP use to communicate with each other. The FX quotes endpoint is I'll rephrase that, an analogy to the quotes endpoint in the FSP IOP API, and it's used to create an agreement between a DFSP and an FXP for a particular currency conversion. And the FX transfers endpoint is used to execute an agreed currency conversion. However, the thing that we add to it is the idea that as part of the FX transfers endpoint, a DFSP should be able to specify that the success of a conversion should be dependent on the success of an associated transfer. And it does this by specifying the transfer ID when it asks for the conversion. Where does that come from, I hear you ask? And the answer is, if you're the payer DFSP who's asking for the currency conversion, then you will know because you are the person who sets the transfer ID for the actual transfer in the first place. If it's the payee DFSP who is asking for the currency conversion, then it will know because it will have received a post-transfers request from the payer DFSP, which will have the correct transfer ID in it. So in both of those cases, the DFSP will know what transfer they want to associate, or the ID of the transfer with which they want to associate the currency conversion. So for agreement, the converting DFSP, which as we've said can be either the payer or the payee, can specify the FXP it wants to use at either the send amount or the receive amount. The FXP sets the terms for conversion, signs them, and returns the condition to the converting DFSP. So the conversion is signed by the FXP. The overall terms are signed by the creditor DFSP. Both conditions are available to the relevant parties, but the non-converting DFSP doesn't need to know anything about the conversion process. So for transfer, the debtor DFSP sends direct to the creditor DFSP. And if the debtor DFSP is doing the conversion, it will be sent in the target currency. If the creditor DFSP is to do the conversion, it'll be sent in the source currency. As we've said, the converting DFSP can specify that the success of a currency conversion depends on the success of a transfer. The switch can do both liquidity checks and funds reservations. There will be a separate module in the switch that manages currency conversions. And if a currency conversion depends on the success of a transfer, then that means the FXP agrees that the switch may finally determine whether the currency conversion succeeds or not. And this is rather analogous to the situation with the payer DFSP. So when the payer DFSP requests a transfer using the post-transfers endpoint, what it's effectively saying is, you people can decide whether this succeeds or not. I can't any longer decide about that. And the FXP is making the same commitment when it responds with a put FX transfers to the switch. It will be saying, you can decide, Mr. Switch, or indeed Mr. Payee DFSP, whether or not this currency conversion succeeds, because it succeeds or fails based on the success or failure of the transfer with which it's associated. So, characteristics of the new architecture is, as I've said, it covers both wholesale and retail conversions. Currency conversions are recorded separately from transfers in the switch, but currency conversion may be associated with a transfer by the use of a common transaction ID, which I think is the way in which we've looked at things in the past. So here we have two examples of how this would work. In the first, the payer DFSP performs the conversion, and you can see over here, Orange Senegal talks to the FXP and says, please convert 5,000 West African francs to the target currency. The FXP sends back the money in the target currency, and the transfer itself then takes place in the target currency. So MTN in Rwanda receives a transfer request in Rwandan francs, which it can honor directly. In the second one, for example down here, the payee DFSP performs the conversion. So in this one, Orange Senegal asks to transfer 5,000 West African francs, I should say, not Rwandan francs. I can see my my cut and paste technique let me down a bit there. So that comes across as, it's all right there, as a request to transfer 5,000 West African francs, which the payee DFSP now asks for conversion from the FXP. And in this case, if conversion succeeds, the payee DFSP can succeed or fail the transfer based on the success or failure of the currency conversion. So that's how it will work in the two different ways of looking at things. How does this look like in the ledgers? A bit more complicated is the answer. So I'm going to go through these in a bit more detail. So first of all, when the payer does the conversion, the sending DFSP debited here, and the FXP is credited, both in the source currency. Okay. In step 2, the sending DFSP is credited and the FXP is debited in the target currency. So now the Orange Senegal, the sending party, has got 10,000 Rwandan francs in its account. Next, we do the transfer itself. So in this case, the sending DFSP is debited and the receiving DFSP is credited in the target currency. And you can see MTN Rwanda has a credit of 10,000 West African francs, Rwandan francs there. When the payee does the conversion, the request is in the source currency. So MTN Rwanda receives a credit of 8,000 West African francs. It then, that should say, yes, step 2. Here we are. The receiving DFSP is debited and the FXP is credited in the source currency. So you can see that we've got a movement, the debit at M2 in Rwanda and a credit at the FXP for 8,000 West African francs. Then in step 3, the FXP is debited and the receiving DFSP is credited in the target currency. So now we have 16,000 Rwandan francs credited to MTN Rwanda and debited from the FXP. Sorry, I'll just go back because there is a point that I should have made here. So you will see that the Orange Senegal has debits for those two transfers in its source currency, West African francs. MTN Rwanda has credits for those two transfers in its currency, in its home currency, Rwandan francs. The transfers through the accounts for the other currency, the non-home currency, you will see balance each other out. So there will always be a net zero balance in all ledgers apart from the home currency ledger for a person. So the balance is here in West African francs for MTN Rwanda, and in Rwandan francs for Oro Senegal will always sum to zero. And it's only the FXP who is getting credits in West African francs and debits in Rwandan francs. Okay, so I'll make ground again and talk about what we propose for this PI. So first of all, final agreement on the API definitions. We're close to that. We're having some discussions, but I think that that's okay. Second, when we originally talked in the reference architecture, and I'm not sure whether that was mentioned in the presentation or not, we thought that we wouldn't need a specialized bounded context, a specialized area to manage currency conversion. And that's because, as I said before, our original architectural thinking was that this would essentially be managed by transfers in the standard FSP API. Now that's not the case, so we will need a separate code area to manage the way in which currency conversions are allowed and recorded. We then propose an FXP simulator, which is built and available for use in sandboxes and hackathons. And finally, the code build tasks for the switch agreed and started. This is not at present an ask for resources. We think that we have those covered, but of course, the more the merrier is our view. And if people are interested in contributing to that, then by all means, get in touch with Leslie Ann or with me. The situation is somewhat different for the ISO20022 question. We would like to encourage the widest possible participation from the ModuLib community in the work that we're doing, which is not necessarily to ask for people to give help in actually writing documents or modifying the data model, but certainly the more information we can get from them, the more discussion information we can get from people about how these things ought to work, the better, and the more likely we are to wind up with a successful definition of a ModuLib ISO20022. So I shall be setting up regular discussion points to talk about how we're doing this and to look at how we might do various parts of the ISO20022 definition. If you are interested, then please mail me and I will make sure that you get invitations when I get around to setting them up. And that, I think, more or less covers the things that I was going to talk about. So are there any questions? I'll take that. No.
Michael, I think I did spot a few questions in the chat.
Yes, I can see about 100 million.
Some of it is just discussion about this, and I think people are somewhat excited about having this in this solid design mode. I do have one question that you could probably address quite quickly. The challenge we had in discussing, and this goes back a couple of years now with Mawali's initial look at how to improve on the FX situation, was that a commitment made in one currency for purposes of reconciliation and proper settlement would need to flow through from the point of agreement all the way through the point of settlement. And while it's going to be somewhat sensitively dependent on how you set your system up, it seems to me that you have structured these in a way that supports that reconciliation, showing the zero balance in currency that's the foreign currency, whereas making sure that you're responsible for your domestic currency. Obviously, the rates used for those two things would need to be the same on both sides or it won't balance. That is, you wouldn't be able to strike a reconciliation balance between the two sides. So how is that structured? So have you given thought to how you get from the agreement phase, where you have presented to the payer the idea of the transaction details, however much of it they're allowed to see, and that those have been, of course, agreed to by the payee, so that the two sides have already agreed in wholesale what they're allowed, what they're going to allow their retail customers to agree to, so that when the payer presents the request to pay, we're now activating that set of end-to-end agreements, just as we do in a domestic case. Is this clear? Or should I add more detail here?
I think you need to add more detail here.
So the point being that in a domestic case, one of the things I don't have to worry about is the value of the currency. Yes. I simply write the number down, and both sides agree that that number means the same thing. That won't work in an FX case, where we now have to agree, and what does that number mean to me in my currency, so that there is an arrangement made at the boundary between the FXP and the two providers, that there is a common understanding of the value in the two local currencies, so that these balances can be made.
Right.
That would be done during agreement in a Mojaloop system, so that we don't even begin to proceed until we understand exactly what the end-to-end value flow is. And this is the point that Mawali made, was that when we get to settlement, we don't want to discover that the rates moved against us. We want to have already reserved amounts, and we want to reserve the ratio that we had at the time we made the agreement, which might have been 5 minutes ago, but it might have been right on the boundary at which we change our FX arrangement. Yep. So we want to know that that's okay, because we made that agreement, and we can flow that through and settle using that ratio, not the new ratio that happens to be in place at the moment we do settlement. You see the issue that arises?
Yes, I do. Yes.
Okay.
So I think that one of the things we've done as part of this, and I didn't explain that, and perhaps I should have done, well, no, I definitely should have done, is that this is not a system that works this is not proposed to be a system that works on rates. It's proposed to be a system that works on amounts.
Okay.
So the question of what rate is offered is not an issue. Essentially, the request that a participant makes, and it could be either the payer or the payee to the FXP, is, if I give you this amount of currency A, how much of currency B will you give me? So at this point, the FXP doesn't need to know anything about the transfer, or even whether there is a transfer that this conversion is funding. It's solely a matter for the understanding of how that relates to a particular transfer or a group of transfers is a matter for the party that's requesting the conversion. Now, then the party, and whichever one it is, will make, the payer DFSP will make a request in a single currency. Now, that currency can be either the source currency, which means that the payee DFSP will need to perform the conversion, or in the target currency, which means that the payer DFSP has performed the conversion. Okay. And the rate at which that has been done will have been set by the separate agreement between whichever participant is doing the conversion and the foreign exchange provider. So they will always be able to tell, and the switch will always be able to tell, in relation to a given transfer that was undertaken backed by a particular currency conversion, what the amounts of that currency conversion were. Does that answer your question?
It does, with one open piece. The payer asks the FXP, if I give you 15 inclusion bucks, how many destination bucks will that result in for the payee? And they give you an answer. How do you secure the agreement?
Well, in the same way as you secure any other agreement, by a condition and an expiry.
But that's a separate condition from the end-to-end agreement, which would necessarily be based.
Absolutely.
Okay. So you have an agreement between the payer and the FX provider that is secured by payment condition, but you also then have a agreement between, in other circumstances, the FXP and the payee if they're the ones doing the conversion. But it's one or the other. You don't need to have both. And then you would have to have an end-to-end agreement, so there's only two agreements that are required.
Yes.
One between the participant that is engaging in exchange conversion and the FXP that provides that conversion. That's one agreement. And the second is the normal end-to-end agreement, which is between the payee and the payer participant, if I understand you then. So this is a significant improvement over where we were before, where we thought we needed to have agreements between the payer and FXP, between the payee FXP, and also end-to-end. And it wasn't clear how you unraveled all of that stuff during settlement. So this sounds like an improvement. Of course, I'd want to work through flows, but this is pretty good.
Well, sorry, I'm cut to the quick minute, which you say it merely sounds like an improvement.
Well, I'm speaking from my frame of reference because I don't completely understand the details in the way that you do. And so I don't mean that as a cut. I mean it only as I directionally in my own understanding. This seems like an improvement of where we were. Well, of course we trust you, Michael. But when it comes to money, and certainly when it comes to FX, as you know, trust has no part to play. Only agreements matter. So anyway, this is great. I appreciate it. Thank you. I don't want to take up any more airtime, but I wanted to understand that flow. And it sounds to me like, if I can summarize quickly, that there are only two payment conditions required: one to secure the rate exchange, and one to secure the end-to-end value between of the two participants with respect to their parties. Does that sound right to you?
It does sound right. I mean, I just want also to pick up, there's a thought in the chat from Douglas Jackson that says, how would this work if you can't convert directly? I.e., if you need to go to a reference currency and therefore need two conversions. I think that's what Douglas's question is. And my answer is, I think we could do that, and so I think this will allow us to do that. But I would need to think about how. So because effectively we've divorced the currency conversion from the transfer, it's no longer the case that the PAX 008, as Douglas suggests, needs to accommodate all the transfer, all the currency conversion amounts, though they can be managed separately. So it would be possible for a DFSP to have more than one of those conversions in order to provide the eventual funds it wanted to execute the transfer.
So you could say then that the FX provider in some condition could provide for the use of a utility currency, but still represent conversion for both ends. And it would then reflect who's the relationship for that conversion. Is it the sending side or is it the receiving side? And I think from what I'm hearing Douglas say is that, well, actually it could be both sides. That is, you want an arrangement where the FX provider, you have two FX providers. You have one that takes you to the utility currency, and you have one that comes out of the utility currency in the destination market. And is there a way to wrap around that? Did I understand that correctly, Douglas? I don't want to step on your question. You may be on mute or unable to come on audio.
Sorry, I'm.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm fumbling my typing because it seems to be set on some mode that erases when I try to edit.
Second thoughts mode, Douglas.
Yeah, in a sense, you answered my question as far as I'm concerned with your description of the FX transfers. And because part of why I was asking relates to the particular implementation that we would like to do, but I think I tentatively see a workaround that would work for our purposes of just having 2 FX transfers and sort of monkeying with that module a little bit.
Well, I think the situation that Miller described is one that would work relatively well in that area. So if you imagine that in the destination, it will almost always be possible, in the destination jurisdiction, it will almost always be possible to obtain a conversion from a utility currency to your target currency, the home currency for that jurisdiction. In the sending jurisdiction, it will almost always be possible to obtain a conversion from the source currency to a utility currency, and that therefore the transaction itself, the transfer itself, will be denominated in the utility currency, which will be converted into at the payer end and out of at the payee end.
Yes, and my only concern was that that both are fully nailed down and specified such that the condition and so forth, the signature specifies. But I think you've provided for it, and I don't mean to hold up the whole group for particularities of sort of our special case.
Okay, no, I mean, I think, as I say, that I'd be happy to take this offline if you want to, Douglas, and just work through how that would work. But I think it would. I'd also like to extend my nascent T-chart expertise to show how that would work in the ledgers. Okay, so if there are no further questions, then I am happy to hand things back to Simeon.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you, everyone, for thank you for the 2 sessions and for your lively participation in the chat. We will take a 4-minute break, after which we will have the next session led by Jason Gregory, who's with us today. So we will start in another 4 minutes. Thank you, everyone.